Good morning, everybody, and warm welcome to the Ecraid launch event. As I wrote in the chat function, unfortunately, this is a virtual meeting. We had planned a nice event here in Antwerp, but unfortunately, because of the Delta threats, we decided early August to cancel this. And we will have, of course, a face-to-face meeting early next year. So once again, a very welcome. I just want to start perhaps with the agenda of the meeting, if I can have the slide, thank you. So I'd just like to walk with you through the agenda of the meeting today. I will start my presentation with the conception of Ecraid. Marc Bonten will then discuss the different Ecraid studies and provide an overview. And he will particularly explain the link between Ecraid and all the different studies, the studies driven by Ecraid, the studies enabled by Ecraid, and then the studies that are affiliated to Ecraid. We will also have a presentation from the European Commission, Arvine Norstedt, a presentation from EMA, Marco Cavalieri, and then if all goes well, we should close the meeting at 16:50. If I could have the next slide. Can you hear me? Because I see a message.
Yes.
You can hear me. Okay, somebody obviously has a problem with the microphone. Okay, so then I can continue. Great. So let me start with the conception of Ecraid. Next slide, please. So this has been a journey so far, and in fact, the two founding projects of Ecraid are Compact and Prepare. Compact is a project that started in January 2013. It's funded by IMI under the New Drugs for Bad Bugs program, and it's focusing on antimicrobial resistance. And in Compact, we established several infrastructures such as CleanNet, LabNet, StartNet, APNet, but we're also making use of the pediatric network of Penta. The second founding project of Ecraid was Prepare. Prepare was a project that was funded through the EU Framework Program 7, started in January 2014 and finished in January 2021, whereas Compact is still ongoing. And Prepare is a project making use of the infrastructure that were built in Compact, so CleanNet, LabNet, but also the pediatric network of Penta. And then in the Prepare, and basically preparing Europe for the next pandemic, we also used a primary care network that we established as part of the GRACE Framework Program 6 project funded between 2006 and 2011. And in fact, already at that time, 2008, 2009, we were thinking of building a sustainable infrastructure for research in primary care. And we had a lot of discussions about this with Theo Verheij, with Paul Little, and with Chris Butler, but we decided at that time that we would not go ahead with such an infrastructure. But we were already thinking at that time how we could make something sustainable. An important milestone for Ecraid was November 2016, where key investigators of Prepare and Compact presented a high-level design of Ecraid, being the, let's say, long-term successor of Compact and Prepare. Another important project, another important milestone was the launch of the Value the X project funded by IMI in March 2019, where started by key partners of Prepare and Compact, together with a number of IVD companies focusing on community-acquired acute respiratory tract infections. And then in February of 2020, we kicked off the Recover project. That's an EU Horizon 2020 funded project, encompassing Prepare's research response actions to the COVID-19 pandemic. And actually, I noticed that James Lee has a very nice slide explaining how Recover emerged, if I may say, from Prepare. And so finally, this year, we started the Ecraid Base project, and hopefully in a couple of months we'll start Ecraid Prime project. And these are again EU-funded projects focusing on respiratory tract infections, and or not only respiratory tract infections, let's say wide range of infections, but these two projects will provide a jumpstart for the Ecraid infrastructure, and I will come back to that later. Next slide. So this is a slide just showing or demonstrating how we have been leveraging EU project investment in clinical research to build these sustainable infrastructures. And on the one hand, you have the infrastructure such as the IMI, Combat, GlinNet, LabNet, EpiNet, and StatNet networks. Then we have the Penta ID pediatric network, the Grace Primary Care Network, the Long-Term Care Facility Network, Biobanking Network, and Data Management. And you can see how these different infrastructures were built through this ad hoc EU project funding. Next slide. Next slide. So this is this is another way of presenting the Ecraid services. So at the top you have the pediatric, the hospitals, the primary care, and the long-term care infrastructure for delivering the clinical research services of Ecraid. Then the two, let's say, lab infrastructures, the LabNet and the BioNet. Then the EpiNet infrastructure for delivering AP research services, and then finally the StatNet, the infrastructure for delivering statistical research services of Ecraid. Next slide. So there was an important project that was launched in January 2019. That was actually on one of the previous slides, and I'd like to discuss here, called Ecraid Plan. And Ecraid Plan was a project of 2.5 years. It finished in June of this year, where the main and only objective basically was to deliver a long-term business plan, sustainability business plan for build Ecraid infrastructure. So this was again an EU-funded project, and when we prepared the proposal for Ecraid Plan, we identified all the EU-funded projects on infectious diseases, and then invited these coordinators and deputy coordinators to join the Ecraid Plan project. And so this is one of the first meetings of Ecraid Plan, where we were asking the coordinators and the deputy coordinators of all the EU-funded projects on infectious diseases where they thought they belonged in the Ecraid ecosystem. And so we had these squares on the floor, in the middle, the core networks, then strategic, then let's say the square for the strategic partners, the square for the partners, and then the square for the end users. And so we were asking them, where do you think belong in the Ecraid ecosystem? That was a very interesting discussion that eventually, if you have the next slide, resulted in the Ecraid architecture. Next slide, please. That resulted in the Ecraid architecture, where we agreed that the headquarters of Ecraid, and Ecraid, of course, an acronym for the European Clinical Research Alliance for Infectious Diseases, where we decided and concluded and agreed that the headquarters of Ecraid should be in Utrecht, and that Ecraid would be supported by what we called the Ecraid chief officers. These are the ECHOs, and these are basically the key academic institutions and infrastructures that have been working in several projects. And the PIs of these ECHOs are basically the members of the coordinating committee, and afterwards other members also join the coordinating committee, but I will explain this later. Next slide. So the PIs of these ECHOs and some other colleagues joining the coordinating committee spent a lot of time discussing the purpose, the vision, but also the values of Ecraid. And so we agreed that the purpose is to reduce the impact of infectious diseases on individual and population health, and that the vision of Ecraid should be to efficiently generate rigorous evidence for new or improved diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of infections, but also to better respond to infectious disease threats. And so this should be facilitated by a European multidisciplinary clinical research network and also by innovative research approaches. Next slide. also spent a lot of time discussing what should be the values of Ecraid. And so these were the 7 values that we agreed. At the heart of the values is scientific independence. And then I'll walk you through the other values in a clockwise manner. So first of all, scientific independence. We concluded that our research should be based on scientific and clinical interests, ensuring the generation of peer-reviewed evidence-based new knowledge that is really the most useful to society, but also that is delivered to the highest possible scientific standards. Then excellence. We concluded that clinical research excellence is up at the highest clinical standards of Ecraid and activities, and that patient safety and also the interest of research participants should always receive our highest priority. The next value was or is not for profit. So what we agreed was that all resources generated by Ecraid services will be reinvested into expanding but also maintaining Ecraid's operational research infrastructures. Transparency was another core value of Ecraid. And here we will operate in transparency. We communicate clearly, but also promote an open debate, and we will make the data and outcomes available in the public, in the public domain in a fair, but also in a balanced way. Responsiveness. We will react with appropriate timelines to the needs of the society in relation to infectious diseases threats. And we will also actively engage, and that's something which we find really important. I'll come back to this. We will actively engage with relevant partners and stakeholders, including also the members of the public. And we are really going to work very hard in our communication strategy to reach out to these relevant partners and stakeholders. Then a very important value as well as sharing the credits and benefits. And we will indeed operate on the basis of equity, integrity, collaboration, and collegiality. And what we really want to do is to build a pan-European inclusive organization for clinical research. And finally, efficiency. The efficiency of our clinical research will be optimized through continuous improvement of the entire research program. Next slide. Core to our services is indeed the establishment of what we call a European warm-based clinical research networks, and this will be achieved through 8 mutually reinforcing what we call operates qualities. So on the left on the slide, you see the current situation with the different infrastructure. So we have around 300 primary care sites in 18 European countries, around 1,000 hospital sites in 42 European countries, around 90 pediatric sites in 18 European countries, and then about 800 labs in 41 European countries. So I'll walk you through the 8 qualities to achieve such a warm-based clinical research network. First of all, organized. The network, let's change something. Sorry. Yeah. So the network has decision-making processes, common network policies, procedures, protocols, and interoperable systems in place. Prepared, obviously, the network is prepared to rapidly initiate a clinical research response to emerging health threats, and this is going to be done in an agile and efficient manner. Engaged means that the sites are engaged in the network level activities and decisions with trusted relationships in place, but also, and most importantly, contractual agreements negotiated, because we realized once again that these contracts can be a bottleneck to launch a clinical research response. Resourced means that the sites are adequately resourced. That's again, it's been a big challenge, and also adequately staffed to efficiently perform the high quality clinical research studies. Active means that the sites should be actively involved in recruiting patients in one or more of the Ecraid clinical studies on a continuous basis. And Marc will come back to this during his presentation on the kind of studies. Trained, the site should be well trained to perform this clinical and laboratory research activities. Extensive. So the network has an extensive European geographic coverage, but we do have also global outreach, and we will be covering all clinical settings, hospital care, primary care, long-term care, etc., and also infectious disease expertise. And again, Marc will come back to that. And then finally, sustainable. The network is financially sustainable in support of its secure long-term continuity. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So this is, let's say, a simplified version, if I may say, of the governance of Ecraid. And the detailed business plan was submitted to the European Commission a couple of months back in June this year. And that's where we explain in great detail how we would like to organize the governance of Ecraid, but this is a simplified version. So basically, there are two levels. There is a strategic level responsible for the oversight and coordination, and then is the operational level. And the operational level is again divided in a operational country level and operational site level. The future not-for-profit foundation will basically consist of, let's say, three important bodies: the supervisory board. And in the supervisory board, basically, you will invite a number of academic institutions of Europe, the management board, I'll come back to the management board, and then the coordinating committee. I already mentioned this in my presentation. These are basically the PIs of the ECOs, and I'll come back to that as well. So once again, the key, let's say, the three bodies that will form the foundation are the supervisory body, management board, and the coordinating committee. And the UMCU is now working on the statutes of the Ecraid Foundation. And for those, let's say, for the Dutch-speaking colleagues present at the meeting, the supervisory board is the Raad van Toezicht, the management board is the Raad van Bestuur, and the coordinating committee is the Participantenraad. Next slide, please. So this is the proposed Ecraid's management board and coordinating committee. It's a proposed board and committee because the process will go as follows. The supervisory board will nominate the members of the management board proposed by the coordinating committee. And so the management board, we decided to keep the management board small, with a CEO, a CSO, and a COO, supported by Frank Dege as a secretary to the board. And so the role of the CEO will be to maintain relationships with public health, with the industry, and also with the policymakers, to oversee the strategy of the foundation that will have been defined by the coordinating committee, and also the CEO will be responsible for communication. The CSO will be responsible for the warm-based studies, and again, Marc will come back to this, to trial design and for statistics. The CSO will also oversee the collection of data and monitor, if I may say, the operational resilience of the infrastructure. And then the COO manages the clinical research services delivery. And then the coordinating committee, again, those are the proposed members of the coordinating committee. We will establish the criteria for being a member of the coordinating committee, but those are the members that we would like to propose: Marion Koopmans, Lenny Derde, Peter Horbeck, Chris Bartlett, Jesus Rodriguez Banyo, Bruno François, Yazdan Yazdanaba, Evelina Taconelli, Stephen Harbour, Carla Jacquinto, Jacques de Mott, Thomas Jenic, Jean-Louis Remet, Nina Gobat, and John Arne Vladimir. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. Can I have the next slides? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we also spent a lot of time on communication, and the communication strategy has been developed by a communication team led by Claire-Marie Martis, with a new brand, new logo, new templates, new websites. And basically, the communication is purpose-driven and people-centered. And I hope you will agree that the template that's been developed provides a warm and inviting color palette, and it also gives an appealing and inclusive edge. And the brand identity features a series of shapes that reference human movement. The communication team decided also to change the logo. So this is the logo in lower cast, and also to use Ecraid either in lowercase or in capital letters. And so it might be a bit confusing, and you need to get used to it, but it makes a lot of sense. So Ecraid in lowercase should be written as if you refer to the organization using the sentence case, whereas if you refer to the Ecraid as a project, then it should be in capital letters as an acronym, for example, Ecraid Base and Ecraid Prime. Again, it's something we need to get used to, but it makes a lot of sense. So next slide. Now, this is an important slide because that is what you can expect from us in the coming months. So in September, we will, of course, work on the contract negotiations of Ecraid Prime. We will continue to work on the protocols and site contracting of the Ecraid-driven studies. And again, Marc will come back to this. A very important event will take place on the 29th and the 30th of September, where we'll organize 3 transition workshops, basically implementing the Ecraid business plan. 2 objectives. One is to agree on the key decision-making processes and implementation regarding the acquisition and conduct of clinical studies in Ecraid. And second, to discuss the clinical trial operations with regards to starting up the trial as well as the execution of the trial. So that's what we will do in September. In October, we will implement the Ecraid Communication Plan, and that's going to be really very important because we want to reach out to IVD companies, to pharma, to patient organizations, to other stakeholders, and we want to do this on a regular basis to start this communication with all these different stakeholders. And then in November, we established Ecraid legal entity in Utrecht, which should be a not-for-profit foundation under Dutch law, and we will also establish the Ecraid boards. Next slide. So let me finish now. We had a very clear vision early 2020 of Ecraid and also of the concept of the legal entity of Ecraid. And then, of course, the world changed because SARS Corona Type 2 decided to spread globally, caused a pandemic, and that had a huge impact on our activities, but it was also, in a way, a fantastic opportunity to test all the procedures and the processes and the mechanisms in place in the PREPARE project, because PREPARE was fortunately still running, so that allowed us to test everything that we had been preparing, if I may say. But it was also a fantastic opportunity to learn from the clinical research response in Europe and also to come up with recommendations for future pandemic preparedness. So those were the main lessons that we learned. First of all, with regards to EU funding for COVID-19 clinical research response, well, this proved to be very flexible and very rapidly available. And we were really impressed how rapidly the European Commission provided funding for clinical research response. However, I have to say that it still wasn't fast enough, and it's not a criticism of the European Commission, it's just that the mechanism wasn't there, because we spent, for instance, 4 weeks in February writing proposals as these were really crucial weeks of the pandemic where we should have been really working hard on the clinical research response. And again, it's not a criticism, but it does tell us that we should have pre-established pools in the future for funding such clinical research response. Second, the EU research projects of the Horizon 2020 program, and there were plentiful of excellent projects. Unfortunately, they were disconnected from clinical research funding of the member states. And that is something I really think should change in the future. The member states should really provide incentives to participate in these many successful EU-funded clinical trials. That's something discussed with CMOs, with ministers. But again, that has to change. There has to be a much better support of the member states of these EU programs. Then also, and it's a bit embarrassing to say, but it was certainly a reality, we noticed that there was a huge competition between hospitals, researchers, and clinicians to enroll patients in clinical trials, but also between therapeutic agents treating thousands of patients without high-quality data collection. That was a problem, particularly during the first wave. So we need to have a mechanism in place for prioritization of clinical research questions and drugs. And then lastly, if you look at the EU clinical research response, yes, for sure, it was fast, but it still wasn't fast enough, and it was too fractured, certainly during the first wave. However, the best clinical evidence was provided by several platform trials, thanks to existing structures, and that could coalesce around a common goal. So another recommendation would be to invest indeed in these pan-European clinical trial networks, in adaptive platform trials, and also in master protocols. So final slide. I think what the COVID-19 pandemic proved was that we were indeed a visionary in building such a sustainable, operational, high-quality, large-scale clinical trials in European infrastructure by bringing together experts in research infrastructure in antimicrobial resistance and in emerging infectious diseases. And when we came up with this idea in 2016, there was a lot of skepticism. And a lot of people were saying, well, this is not going to work because these are actually bringing together two worlds. Let's say mainly bacteriologists working on antimicrobial resistance and mainly virologists working on emerging infectious diseases. But I think the COVID-19 pandemic has proven that scientists on AMR and emerging infectious diseases work feverishly to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it really proved that this was a visionary approach of future clinical research in Europe. So this is therefore a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to gear up the public and private resource already invested in Combat and Prepare, but also in the many other EU, but COVID-19, but also other EU-funded projects, such as the GRACE, Value the X, Recover, the EU Response, Orchestra, Accelerate, and maybe I've forgotten a few others. But again, this is really the moment now to capitalize on these investment debates made, I should say, by the European taxpayer. Next slide, please. So many thanks for your attention, and I welcome questions. I think Ram will look at the chat box to see if there are any questions. Happy to take them. If not, we can always come back to questions later today. Are there any questions? No questions. Again, we will. How is the link between? How's the link with countries outside of the EU? So thank you for that question. As you have realized, Ecraid spans the European continent, not just the EU, because we have hospitals and primary care sites and labs outside of the European Union. So also, I think there's echo. Yeah, outside of the European Union. But we also have worked with hospitals globally to support clinical trials, to train labs participating again in clinical trials. So although, of course, our focus is on the European continent, we do have a lot of collaborations also globally. And I hope that in other continents of the world, similar infrastructure, similar networks will be developed, and that we could even work more globally. Because I think, again, coming back to your question, I think it's fair to say that the global response, global clinical research response, certainly during the first wave, has failed. And there was basically no global clinical research response, certainly not during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah, Fergal Donnelly provides an interesting comment to that as well, that other countries are affiliated, of course, with the Horizon program. Absolutely. Thank you for helping me to answer that question, Fergal. Thank you. Okay, so if no other questions, and again, we can come back to some of the issues later today. And you're very welcome to send me an email, and I can answer your questions also by email. But if not, I suggest that we continue our program, and I would like to invite Marc to present the Ecraid studies and an overview of these studies and how they are linked to Ecraid.
Yes, thank you, Herman. My pleasure to give this presentation after all the work. Next slide. Yes, where Ecraid comes from, a little bit already explained by Herman. It was Combat and it was Prepare. And Combat was there to create a self-sustaining antibacterial development network because of the recognized insufficiencies in clinical evaluation of new antibiotics. When we started this, we were expected to expand the research and laboratory network to optimally align clinical trials with investigator sites in order to increase that efficiency of antibiotic development, and also to use cutting-edge molecular methodologies and new ways for trial design. And then came Prepare, which had nothing to do with antibiotic resistance. And this was a project, as Herman mentions, that should us prepare to rapidly respond to any severe infectious disease outbreak in the future. It was actually funded because of the problems we had seen during the Mexican flu pandemic, when all the research actually started after the pandemic had passed. So the goal was there to provide real-time evidence for clinical management of patients and for informing public health responses in a future pandemic. Next slide. So this was the problem that PREPARE addressed. Here comes the pandemic, the initial public health response, the immediate preclinical research response. Please go back one slide. And then the clinical research response comes late and is not able to inform the other two. So the goal of PREPARE was to change this into the following pandemic curve. Next slide. Here we see the same curve, the same responses, but now they are intertwined, happening almost at the same time, and therefore to be of use. The question is whether we succeeded completely to that, but I think we did a lot better than before that we had PREPARE, and I will give you an example of that. Next slide. So this was for COMBACT. COMBACT was there to establish a network. We started in 2013, and here we see, let's say, the results of 2014 and 2021. So 7 years of work. The number of hospitals that were part of the network actually increased from 400 to more than 1,000. But more importantly, the number of hospitals that actively participated in any study was more than 400, I think 450 in 2021. The country reach increased to all European countries. We had numerous and built up numerous contacts with physicians, laboratory physicians across Europe. Very importantly, that was also one of the aims of COMBACT, is that we GCP trained many physicians and other researchers doing clinical research, especially in Eastern Europe. There was a huge difference when we started this. Many researchers and physicians in Western European countries were fully trained for GCP and allowed to do clinical research, and that was not the case in many other parts in Europe. And COMBACT contributed significantly to that training, allowing all these physicians and researchers to participate in clinical research. The first year we started with 5 studies, and in 2021 we could say that we had already launched 37 studies, in which more than 39,000 patients at that time, but now it's already more than 40,000 patients have been enrolled. Next slide. In doing these studies, we try to learn from the sites and we try to improve the sites. And we also measure the performance of clinical study sites. So during the years, we have built a system to quantify the site performance. We have quantitative site performance indicators in the first bullet, purely quantitative, but also qualitative. We have national coordinators and we ask for their opinion. We get the data from feasibility questionnaires. We know whether sites have been selected for an interventional or observational study. We know how many trials the site has participated in. And then we have also some country specifics that we take into consideration. And then, next slide, we can actually quantify the performance of sites. And if we look at that performance indicator, we here listed the top 50 sites in Europe according to our performance indicators of the studies performed within the context of COMBACT. And we can see that we have worked with excellent sites in many European countries, and especially in France and Spain and the United Kingdom and Belgium. Well, then I also need to say Greece and Serbia. We had many good sites that we could work with. So this is a list that is very extensive. This is just the first top 50, the first 50 sites that pop up in this performance indicator. Next slide. So our goals with Ecraid is operational excellence, and that should come, and we hope that it comes from all the experience built up in CLINET and LabNet, the COMBACT network. Then we want to have scientific innovation in trial design. And for that, we hope to build up, we will build further the StatNet collaboration. We want to have optimal sharing of epidemiological data, and EpiNet is a very good start of that. It started in COMBACT MagNet, a little bit later than CLINET and LabNet and StatNet started, but it has produced extensive work over the years. And then we also want to have the optimal preparation for a scientific response to an immediate new infectious disease threat, and that's where we can build on the PREPARE response modes that have been developed and actually have been tested last year. Next slide. So what is scientific excellence, operational excellence? This is an example coming from ComebackNet, which I consider as executional excellence. It is a study, a very simple, prospective, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study with a new medicine, and this is a monoclonal antibody against a toxin of Staphylococcus aureus. But it's not such a simple study. Next slide. Because for this study, you want to have a patient population that is enriched for the endpoint of this study, which was Staphylococcus aureus pneumonia in intensive care patients. So to give this new medicine a chance to prove itself, you need to have a population, a control population, a total population with a high incidence of the disease. So for that, the collaboration between the pharmaceutical company that owned the compound and the academic community as part of COMBACT resulted in this study design where the screening of patients for Staph aureus carriage and the absence of anti-staphylococcal antibodies during the first days of ICU admission were critical components. That made the study extremely complex and difficult to execute, but still we succeeded in having about 200 patients randomized in a relatively short period of time. Next slide. And when the data then were analyzed, we saw that for the primary endpoint, indeed, the incidence of Staph aureus pneumonia was 26%. In the group that was treated with the new drug, suvratuximab, the incidence was 30% lower. It was a phase 2 study. And because of these very promising results, next slide, this compound is now going into phase 3. And this will also be done in the COMBACT network. Next slide. At the same time, there was another similar monoclonal antibody. It was not monoclonal, it was a two fully human IgG1 monoclonal antibodies that together neutralized 6 Staph aureus toxins. This study was more or less at the same goals, tested more or less the same drug, although before the study it was fair to say that this one was the more promising antibody. But this trial was terminated prematurely due to fatality, and the incidence of Staph aureus pneumonia was 6% in the control group, where they also aimed for 26%. So because of aspects of the study design and the study execution, this product failed. And it's very sad to say that this antibody combination is now no longer tested for clinical utility. It just has disappeared, not because it has demonstrated to be of no use or not to be safe, just because it failed because of the study design was, in my opinion, not excellent. Next slide. Scientific innovation in trial design is also important. Next slide. Not sure. Please, yeah. And let me give you one example of innovation in trial design. So usually we do randomized controlled trials. We have eligible patients and then they are randomized to treatment A or B. And this randomized controlled trials was actually, let's say, being used for the first time or designed at the time that the telephones looked like the telephone at the left side of your slide. That's the randomized controlled telephone. It works, but it's not very advanced. Today, telephones look like the ones that you see on the other side. It's much fancier, it's much faster, it has much more functions, and it's fast, as I mentioned, it's faster. So the scientific innovation here was to start the use of adaptive platform trials. You can hear that I'm working from hospital today, and it's hopefully I'm not COVID patients. Next slide. There they go. Next slide, please. So in Prepare, we started to build an adaptive platform trial in 2014. And it took us several years. And I vividly remember Derek Angus telling me at one of the first meetings we had in discussion, let's design, let's create some cool piece of science. And actually that became the adaptive platform trial REMAP-CAP. And I think REMAP-CAP is a success during the COVID pandemic. if you continue to click, you will see several of the publications that came out of REMAP-CAP in the last year in high impact journals, significantly contributing to the knowledge that we have nowadays on the optimal treatment of COVID patients. So here we have seen operational excellence and scientific innovation. And these are the aspects that we really want to establish and to build in Ecraid. Herman already alluded to the services that we have and the establishment, how we think that we can establish this European one-based clinical research network by being organized, well prepared, engaged, appropriately resourced for the centers, active, trained, extensive, and very importantly, sustainable. So what are we going to do? This slide is not intended for you to read, but it tells you that we are not limited to a certain type of study. We can do investigator-initiated studies, but also industry-initiated. We can do observational studies and interventional studies. Can be addressing preventive measures, treatment, diagnostic interventions, screening, epidemiological studies, quality of life evaluations, and even health economics. And actually we have done phase 2 and phase 3 and phase 4 studies, but hopefully in the future, we may as well take on phase 1 studies if we get a chance to do that. So the studies we intend are not limited. And that what innovative design elements have we thought of and did we describe in our business plan? The first one on the left side is an important one, which we already started with, and that is continuous enrollment. We are designing perpetual observational studies as a kind of a backbone infrastructure in which, for example, a nested trial, that's number E, can be implemented. Or such a trial can have 2 or more control groups, that they share the control groups in one single trial, and that is posted under B. We have now experience with response adaptive randomization, and that also could be of help in future studies. And very importantly as well, we're thinking about using master protocols where possible to create efficiency in building in all these other innovative design aspects. And of course, what I now think is maybe the summum of let's say, innovative design, the platform design. This is, of course, the experience we have built up with REMAP-CAP. I'm not sure that that design is needed for all research questions to be answered in clinical trial world, not at all, but there where we can find, let's say, the disease patterns where a platform design could help us in making evaluations more efficient. I think we will try to build those designs and those platform trials in the coming years. Next slide. Next slide. Please give me the... Next slide, please. Good. How to build that broad portfolio of studies. This is a very complex slide, so I will take some time to explain this to you. The core is the perpetual observational studies. And these can be done, and we can see that at the left side, in the ICU, in the ER, and in primary care. These are the wards that are depicted here. And the diseases that can be studied are VAP, ventilator-associated pneumonia, QT, that's complicated urinary tract infections, ARI, acute respiratory infection, disease X, that's a disease that we still don't know, but that may cause a pandemic in the future, and also acute respiratory infection, but this is now in primary care. This is what the colors do. And these continuous, these perpetual observational studies, they continue. And within that frame, other studies can be nested. We can have, let's say, in light color, the industry or investigator-driven plug-in studies that use this network, use these perpetual observational study as a basis for their study. And that can also be ad hoc industry and or other investigator-driven studies using the randomized trial approach. So with the perpetual observational studies, we intend to build an infrastructure where other studies can be nested, where with a higher efficiency because these sites are well trained. They are already enrolling patients for a certain disease spectrum, making, let's say, the start of a study and the quality of the study much better than you will need than when you start such a network from scratch. Next slide. So these perpetual observational studies are complemented with adaptive platform trials. I already mentioned that we have REMAP-CAP and now also REMAP-CAP for COVID. We are collaborating with the EU response, which will be explained later during this meeting. And we will collaborate, and actually, as part of Ecraid, we have Ecraid Prime. And also that will be explained in detail during this meeting. So these perpetual observational studies, as you can see there, are currently funded by Ecraid Base, the Horizon 2020 program. And here are just the numbers that we envision that we will, let's say, have in the coming years. For example, for ventilator-associated pneumonia, 40 ICU sites in 15 countries, enrolling a total of 4,000 patients per year. That's the ambition, and that's what we are working towards. And that's also for the other diseases. Next slide. We don't have to start from scratch, because for ventilator-associated pneumonia, we already have the honest PrEP study in COMBAT-NET, which actually is a preparatory study for the perpetual observational study. For the acute respiratory tract infections presented in ER units, we are setting up the adequate study, and we have a lot of experience with the Mermaids RE studies that were part of PREPARE and have been enrolled during COVID. And also in primary care, please go back one slide, also in primary care related to acute respiratory tract infections, we have the Principal study and the Prudence study that use the same network and that we can build on to build the perpetual observational studies. Next slide. So how do these studies relate to Ecraid? We have distinguished three types of associations with Ecraid: Ecraid driven, Ecraid powered, and Ecraid affiliated. Ecraid driven actually is very clear. The operating model is represented within Ecraid's coordinating committee by a study director and who is responsible for the end-to-end study delivery and quality. There's full enrollment of the Ecraid Warm-based sites and infrastructure. It's actually, you could say, owned by Ecraid and compliant to the Ecraid data standards and systems. And it has made extensive use of the menu of services within Ecraid. Next. Can you click? Then we see the type of studies that are Ecraid driven. These are adequate, please stop. Yeah, adequate, prudence, SOS COVID, REMAP-CAP, Ecraid Prime, the 4 perpetual observational studies, the 5 perpetual observational studies that will be started as part of Ecraid Base. Then we have Ecraid powered study. No, please. That's represented within the Ecraid governance, and there's someone responsible for the quality of delivered minimal services and the used infrastructure. The enrollment of science is aligned with the Ecraid standards. It's compliant to part of the Ecraid standards and systems, but there is minimal use of the Ecraid menu. So there's a clear connection to Ecraid, but it is partly outside Ecraid, and that's fine, and that's where we can help. And if you click now, we see now the projects, Reverse, Accelerate, NEO IPC, Verdi. All these studies need to start yet, and all these studies have a connection to Ecraid and use parts of Ecraid. And then there is Ecraid affiliated, and that's actually run by a principal investigator who is part of the Ecraid coordinating committee, but most of the activities are, actually almost all activities are executed outside the Ecraid infrastructure. And an example of that is EU response. That will also be presented later during this meeting. So these are the different connections that we see with Ecraid. Now, Ecraid has, let's say, came from somewhere, and the currently active projects, consortia, are listed here: Value-DX, Recover, Ecraid Base, and Ecraid Prime. Dare to say that they provided us with a substantial budget to start our activities and hopefully give us a flying start to create a, let's say, very successful and financially sustainable organization for the future. Next slide. So the aim is to make these clinical studies more efficient, to reduce the time between the start of the study, the design, the setup, the execution, the closure and dissemination. And we have set ourselves a target to reduce that time by at least 28%. That's of course a very arbitrary figure, but that's what we intend. So each time that we think of a study, we think of the question, how can we make this, can we execute this study? How can we deliver the research answer more efficiently and faster? Next slide. So how to be successful, and this is my final slide. We have created an infrastructure with a single point of access for anyone interested in executing clinical trials. We can have a single sponsor for all these studies, the Ecraid Foundation for the Ecraid-driven studies. We will use master contracts with clinical sites and laboratories in our network. We will streamline the study approval processes. We will use pre-approved protocols for response activities. We will have an overarching data collection tool. We will have professional dissemination of study findings and epidemiological data. And I'm sure there are more points that could be listed here. Most importantly for me is that I hope that we can deliver cool science, as Derek Angus called it, in the coming years to answer important questions for our patients. Next slide. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and if there are questions, very happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Marc. That was a wonderful presentation, and hope that it will be clear to everybody now the link and to all the different studies to Ecraid, and also how we plan the future for clinical research and clinical research response in Europe. So that was a wonderful presentation, Marc. Any questions for Marc? You may need some time to digest this. Massive amount of information, but are there any burning questions? Maybe I'll pause for a minute or so. So, Marc, there's a question from Eveline. Would it be possible to, Eveline Poort of the Commission, would it be possible to elaborate a bit on the efforts for harmonization across studies that are planned? Marc?
Yeah, sure. We had a very, let's say, productive meeting yesterday with the Ecraid base team and all the PIs of the Perpetual observational studies. And we will, let's say, align where possible, for example, in the contracting, in the data management structure, in the approval processes for IRB approvals, but also in, let's say, research questions, and also in preparing ourselves for, let's say, a response mode whenever that is needed again. So this is one of the most important things, the harmonization of processes. Of course, we are dealing with different diseases. Ventilator-associated pneumonia is different from complicated UTI. So there will be differences in the, for example, the ECRF, but I think and I'm sure that we will come up with an ECRF that is let's say, has a lot of core information that is similar across the studies, and then very detailed information for the specific different diseases that are studied. So yes, there will be harmonization.
Okay, and then a follow-up on that. Thanks, she says. What about data collection tools and data sharing, Marc?
Yeah.
Again from Evelyn.
Yeah, same story. There will be one overarching data collection tool. Complicated as it is, but that's what we're going to do. And this is in the hands of Thomas Jenis from the work package data. He has a large experience with setting up such data systems, and he is supported by many experts in that field. Okay.
And then there is a question from one of our dear colleagues and friends, Francesco Blasi, who was also very important for the success of GRACE. So wonderful that you join us today, Francesco. So Francesco has a question about the emergency rooms study. Does that mean in hospital studies? I think that's the question.
Yeah, so with ER studies, we mean patients that are seen first in the ER. So that could be acute respiratory tract infection or complicated UTI. we expect many of these patients to be hospitalized, so data collection and follow-up will be in the hospital, but patients can also be discharged from the ER. For example, in the adequate study, we will also follow up patients that, because of the interventions, are not hospitalized.
Okay, and then the question from Leo van den Heuvel, will post-study data be ongoing, available to trigger pharma to step in? Good question. Yeah.
Yes, where legally allowed, but one of the ambitions, of course, is that we will regularly present the status of our studies with important epidemiological data. Together with EpiNet, we will, let's say, post or publish that information. And if pharma has specific questions on a certain disease related to what, for example, is the incidence of pneumonia in your network caused by a certain pathogen, then of course we can derive that data from our system.
Yeah, and then a question from Philippe Cléziat. So welcome, Philippe, from bioMérieux. What could or will be the relationship between Ecraid and regulatory bodies and health technology assessment bodies?
Not sure how to answer the question, but of course we hope and we will work towards a system that our network structure can be used for studies that are performed for regulatory purposes. Not sure what exactly meant, what our relationship then will be. I hope that we will have a very good relationship with EMA and with health technology assessment bodies. In our, let's say, participating universities, we have also, let's say, experts on health technology assessment, but of course, but that's probably not what Philippe is asking here.
Yeah, but indeed, we had a very good relationship with EMA, Marco Cavalieri, who's also in the program later today, and it's clear that EMA should have an important place in the governance structure of Ecraid. Yeah. Are there any more questions? No. Okay, great. So we are perfectly on time, Marc. I suggest that we have our lunch, our coffee or tea break or whatever break you wish to have, and that we will reconvene in 15 minutes. So we'll start again at 11:15 sharp. Thank you.